Welcome to tonight's evening of Soroptimist International and the Equality Rights Alliance webinar on affordable housing. Before we get started this evening, just want to run through a couple of housekeeping things about how the webinar is going to run. On your right-hand side, you'll have a webinar dashboard. Clicking on the little orange arrow is a toggle switch. It will move that dashboard, close it, and clicking on it again will open it. Whilst the webinar is on, you will all be muted. You do have the opportunity down the bottom of your dashboard here to ask questions. So please type in here any questions that you may want to ask so that I can note them down. When the time comes after the webinar is finished, I will unmute you so that you can ask that question. If you are having any trouble hearing this evening's meeting, you can go to the toll-free number, which is listed to your right-hand side there in the middle, and dial that number in. It's also on your email that you received. So you can phone in instead of using your computer, microphone and headset to hear it. Presently, I'm going to pass this meeting over to Soroptimist International National Representative of Australia, Anne Sheehan, who is going to introduce the program for you this evening. Anne Sheehan is the Australian National Representative of Soroptimist International of the Southwest Pacific. Anne has been a Soroptimist since 1998 when she joined SI Hornsby in Northern Sydney. Anne has been the Australian National Rep since May 2014. She is a member of the Hornsby Homeless Task Force and is at present working with her club to set up much needed women's refuge. She has worked as a general practitioner for many years, for the past 25 years as a principal in a large and busy general practice in New South Wales, with special interest in women's health and preventative medicine. I'll now pass the microphone over to Anne.
Thanks, Christine. I'd like to welcome everybody, and we're so pleased you could join us tonight. What I'd like to do first is to introduce Helen Daly-Fisher from the Equality Rights Alliance, and we're most grateful to Helen for preparing and presenting this webinar tonight. Helen has a background in the law, initially practicing as a solicitor in employment and discrimination law with Minter Ellison in Sydney, then moving into the community legal sector. She was Principal Solicitor of the New South Wales Disability Discrimination Legal Centre, and then with the ACT Welfare Rights and Legal Centre. For the past 10 years, her areas of practice have included disability discrimination law, tenancy law, social security law, working both on the front line and in law reform advocacy. In 2003, she took part in the I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. She represented the National Association of Community Legal Centres at the UN in New York and Bangkok in negotiations regarding the drafting of the Disability Rights Convention. So Helen has a very, very important background in anti-discrimination. ERA is the Equality Rights Alliance, and it's a network, it's one of the alliances, it's a network of 62 women's organisations. Soroptimists have been a member of this alliance for many years, and ERA is currently focusing on affordable housing for women, bringing international human rights into the domestic context and sexual and reproductive health. I'd like now to hand over to Helen to tell us a little bit more about ERA and just talk about the agenda for the meeting. Thanks very much. Thank you, Helen.
Just one moment while I change presenters. I'm sorry, Helen must be having trouble. Helen, can you hear me?
I can. I've actually just encountered a technical problem. Apologies, everybody. I appear to have lost my presentation.
Yes, your computer, according to me, your computer's not linked
Just going
in.
to take me 1 moment. See how that goes, because I'm now seeing it.
No, it's still not noticing you. Perhaps,
Okay.
I'm just thinking, can you please exit the meeting? Oh, wait a minute. No, that's good. Are you still there, Helen?
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay, it's now... Oh, no, I've lost you again. It's not staying...
1 moment. Let's try this. Is that better?
No. No, it's still... I can see your name, but your screen and everything isn't there for me to be able to choose you.
So shall I come out and go back in?
I think that might... No, wait a minute. It's looking better.
I seem to still be seeing your
Yes, I can't
slideshow.
choose you because it's saying that you're not attentive, which we know is not true. Damn. Okay.
If I close the window with your presentation in it, will that assist?
Pardon?
I'm looking at your presentation at the moment. If I close that window, will that help?
No, it won't, because what I need to do is change you as presenter so that we can see your monitor and you have the availability to do that. I'm sorry, everybody, for this technical difficulty. These things sometimes happen and put us at huge stress levels. All right, so Helen, do you mind emailing your presentation to me? Oh, wait a minute, that's not going to work. I don't have Prezi. Oh, you wouldn't believe it, everybody. We just checked all this out not 15 minutes ago and it worked beautifully. I really am at a loss as to know what to do. Hold on. Screen sharing. Stop my screen sharing. No, for some reason I cannot. I'm just going to try something different. Helen, I've just sent you an email. Would you mind clicking on that link when you get it? And see if that will bring you in so that I can change presenters.
It tells me that I have a session running already.
Yes.
And can't join another.
Hold on. Okay. Seth, I've just unmuted you. You had your hand up. No, sorry, Helen, I just can't. It just keeps coming up and telling me that your monitor is not attentive, and therefore I can't swap. I can't swap.
Well, why don't I send you through the presentation and we'll ignore the Prezi part of that presentation for the moment.
All right then. I apologise, everybody.
Christine, it's Anne here. If Helen's sending through the presentation, could she dial in and present it on the phone?
Are you having trouble with audio?
No, I'm talking about Helen.
No. The phone won't give us
okay,
the video.
sorry.
That's the problem.
Yep.
For some reason, Helen's computer is coming up as non-attentive, and therefore I can't pass the presentation view to her. Whereas when we tried it 20 minutes or so ago, it did work.
I've just emailed that through to you. Would you like me just to try logging out and logging back in again to the
yes,
webinar?
while I do this, yes. Thank you.
Cool.
Cess, did you want to say something? I have unmuted you.
Oh. Well, I'll just check that one.
Hello, how are you? No, I know you did, but I've been busy and then.
Right, I think that is now going to work. I've got Helen's presentation up. Helen, you can, your voice can be heard.
Hi there, everyone.
Yep.
Can everybody hear me? Oh, good.
Just put some hands up. Just click the hands up button so make sure that we can all hear everybody. Great. Yep, I've got a few hands up. That's good. Everybody can see the monitor. Yep, it's looking good now, Helen. I'll unmute myself. I'll mute myself and away you go.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for sorting that out, Christine. There's nothing quite like technological gremlins to get adrenaline really running. I'd like to start by giving some really profound thanks to Soroptimist for hosting this, because ERA is facing an interesting situation at the moment. We're an organisation who has been doing national level policy work in affordable housing for women for some years now. And we are faced with an interesting situation under the current government where there is a very strong view in government that federal level politics shouldn't be playing much of a role in relation to affordable housing, and that it is in fact primarily a state and territory and local government issue. There are arguments you can make that certainly support that position, but for ERA that's a difficulty because we only operate at the national level. And so one of the strengths of the Alliance model is that we can reach out to our membership and say, look, there's an issue that we need to take beyond the national level, something like housing. Can you help us? And so this seminar is the first step in a sort of gradual process that ERA is going to go through in building up the capacity of our member organisations to be able to do some of this advocacy work at different levels of government and different levels of society in order to make sure that the work that we're doing actually follows through at all the necessary levels. So thanks very much, particularly to Anne and Christine, for organising this. I'll start with a brief description of what the Equality Alliance is, because it's an odd beast. It's one of 5 national alliances, women's alliances, that are funded through the Office for Women by the Commonwealth Government. We've been around for 4 years now, and this organisation had a previous incarnation as an organisation called Women Speak for 3 years prior to that. So we've been around for a very long time. We're a national level network, as I was saying, of 62 organisations now as of last month, and we have a focus on women's equality. Some of the other national women's alliances have very specific areas of focus. For ERA, we have a very generalist position, and that is quite useful because it means that we can pick up areas that the other alliances don't cover, things like housing. We work on a framework that promotes women's equality, women's leadership and recognition of women's diversity. We use a human rights framework based on international human rights principles. We have a very small secretariat of 3 part-time staff, one of whom is me. I'm the program manager, and we've got Hannah as our project officer 4 days a week, and we've got Alyssa, who is a new employee who's come in as our admin officer 2 days a week. Apart from our little secretariat team, we rely very heavily on the members of ERA, of our 62 member organisations, and we get a fantastic response from our members. So ERA's reach and breadth is far greater than it should be. We punch a long way above our weight. Our main areas of focus, as Anne was saying earlier, at the moment are affordable housing for women, sexual and reproductive health, bringing international human rights into the domestic context in Australia, and promoting young women's voices. I'll have the next slide, please, Christine. I thought before I go too far into this presentation, I'd start by defining a bit of terminology, because different terms get bandied about in this area, and if you don't know what's encompassed by those terms, things can get a little bit confusing. So we're going to be covering discussions about both properties that are owned, so with or without mortgage. When we're talking about people owning their properties, they may not actually own the property outright. There may be people who have a mortgage over the property. And we'll be talking about people who are in private rental, and by that we mean people who have a contract, a private contract with a landlord, whether through a property manager or whatever, but in the private market. Then there's the other form of rental housing, which is either public or community housing. Public housing is state-owned housing for people on low incomes generally. There can be different categories and different criteria for qualifying for that housing. As an alternative to public housing, we also have community housing, which is owned and operated by either charities or not-for-profit organisations, organisations that have a charitable intent or a not-for-profit intent in their organising their housing. When you talk about public and community housing combined, many people refer to it as social housing, and that's the term that I'll be using. The other interesting area of terminology is terminology around homelessness. There's been a lot of debate over a number of years about the definition of homelessness, and there's been some very good work done by the ABS's Gender Review Committee, who have looked into the different ways that men and women react to homelessness and have improved the definition of homelessness to include both primary homelessness, which is the traditional sort of homelessness that we see portrayed in the media, so rough sleeping, living in your car, that sort of thing, but also to include secondary and sometimes what's called tertiary homelessness, which is homelessness that doesn't involve actually being unsheltered, but does involve living in circumstances where you don't have any right to remain or to enforce your continued location in a particular property. So where you don't have any security of tenure. And that includes things like couch surfing, mum coming to live with the kids, people going home to live with their parents, all those sorts of categories get caught up in secondary homelessness as a definition. And so when we talk about homelessness, we're talking both about that rough sleeping stereotype, but also about those more difficult to define categories of people who haven't got somewhere they can actually call their own. The other interesting term is housing stress. There are lots of different ways to cut housing stress, and as you'll see later on in this presentation, we've got some concerns about the way that's done in relation to women's housing stress. But generally they all tend to revolve around this idea that if you're paying 30% of your income on your housing costs, be that your mortgage repayments, your rental payments, that sort of thing, then you are in housing stress. Usually when figures of how many people are in housing stress are calculated, there are complicated formulas to remove the outliers and make sure the figures are firm. So they might not include the top 10% of earners and the bottom 10% of earners when they calculate those figures. But generally speaking, we're looking at that concept of 30% of your income. Next slide, please, Christine. So what I'd like to talk about now is the current housing situation. So give you a flavour for why it is that we've all got this feeling that things are bad in relation to housing. After I've discussed that, I'll have a look at housing as a gendered issue and why ERA is interested in it, and some of the key messages that it would be great to get out there at all levels of government. Once we've looked at that, we'll do a quick run through who does what in housing at government levels, and then we'll have a quick look at some advocacy tips for people who want to go out and start actually meeting with politicians to discuss these issues. So thinking about where we are at the moment, if you look at a simple indicator like where's the average rent and income price in relation to each other. So if we've got income rising sort of at a slow, steady rate on that earnings line, which is the brown line you can see there, we've got the dark line, which is very high, is house prices. And you can see there's been a really steep line there, which is echoed a little more slowly by the grey line, which is rents. And what that's interesting is that it tells us that the increase, the main driver for the current housing affordability issues that we have is that rise in housing prices, and that's trickling down through to the rent prices. Housing supply and demand is driven largely by middle to high income owner investors and renters who make the private rental market increasingly inaccessible for low to medium income renters. While social housing lists continue to stagnate, the market's still short about 500,000 affordable properties. So that means properties that are in the lower end of the price bracket. So we've got sort of 500,000 people sitting there in the lower income group who don't actually have properties available to them because the property market is slightly skewed towards the upper end of the market. Rental affordability for households on lowest incomes is continuing to worsen. And the impact of the housing crisis on lower income households is more acute because that limited capacity to compete for housing in the private rental market makes things really difficult. When you're in the lowest 10% of households by income, rental stress has jumped from 49.2% in 2007 to 8, so just under half of people in the lowest 10% of households, all the way up to 60.8% in 2009-2010. Now we haven't seen that come down, so that's of concern. If you're in that lowest group of income earners, most people will be in housing stress. And when you look at this average rent and income prices graph, you can see that that's not surprising because the earnings line we've got there is a median earnings line. So you can see that the lower 10% earnings line will be a lot below, lower than that. Next slide, please. So if we have a look at what the reality is for some of those housing options for people in the lower 10% of the market, as I was saying, the private rental market rents are now more or less out of reach if you're in the lower end of the income scale. So your options are basically social housing or heading into homelessness situations. So if we look at what's happening in community housing recently, you can see that the community housing list has remained fairly steady since about 2012. There were dips in 2010 and 2011, and our cut of the data seems to indicate that that was due to the national stimulus response to the global financial crisis, when a significant amount of money was put into housing in the short term. So it's interesting to see that that approach actually did have an effect on the figures that we saw. That stimulus money went specifically into community housing. It didn't go into public housing, and you'll see that the effect in the public housing graph is much less. One of the important things about this graph, though, is that it tells us that the situation for people who are waiting for community housing, and these are the waiting lists essentially, is becoming more and more acute. The red part of the graph tells you about people who are community housing applicants who are in the greatest need. So those categories vary from provider to provider, but generally they require you to not only be in urgent need of housing, but also to have a number of factors which make you particularly vulnerable. The sort of things might be that you are in need of escaping from a violence situation, that you have children who are at risk, that you have a disability, which makes it impossible for you to be in the private rental market, things like that. And so we're seeing that a greater proportion of the people who are waiting for community housing are people in real need, and that's of concern. So back in 2009, those of greatest need made up about 45% of the waiting lists. Today it's come up to 65%. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see the similar figures for public housing. And you'll see there that, interestingly, people in greatest need make up a lower proportion overall of the number of people waiting for public housing. That's probably because community housing often, or in some cases, has a slant towards people with particular needs. So you can have community housing provided for older women, you can have community housing provided for people with disabilities and so on. And so you would expect to see a higher proportion there. But what's interesting about the public housing graph is that it mirrors the community housing graph, in that the proportion of greatest need applicants is increased. It's almost doubled since 2009. The demand for social housing essentially continues to far outstrip supply. And it's worth me pointing out that this is in the context of a major concerted effort having been made by state, territory and the federal governments to pour money into this sector since 2009. We're not seeing these figures shift despite that effort. The increases in public housing waiting lists are of particular concern, given that we're receiving anecdotal evidence from our members that women are giving up on public housing as an option and are no longer putting their names on public housing lists. Instead, they're preferring sort of homemade options such as returning to live with the kids or moving in with mum and dad. And despite that fall-off, and we're hearing that story a lot, but despite that, the waiting lists are remaining stubbornly high, which suggests that there are new people coming into them despite the fall-off. On to the next slide. This is where we begin to see why the private rental market is not accessible to anybody on a low income and is only occasionally accessible to people on moderate incomes. If you have a look at percentages of households who are in stress, we see that among all households, 23% of households are in mortgage stress, and 33% are in rental stress. A third of renters among all households are in housing stress. Among low-income households, of course, the figures are much higher. So we're looking at 53%, more than half, of households in rental stress, and 40% of people who have a mortgage are in housing stress as well. Median rent as a percentage of median income is now perilously close to 30%, and that's a bad thing because it means that when you're somebody who is earning a median income, so somebody like a nurse or an early childcare educator, you are not actually going to be able to rent a private market property without going into housing stress. So at the moment, or in 2011, the last reliable figure we've got, the figure stood at 26.9%. So the median rent in the private market was 26.9% of the median income. So that's very close to that 30% mark. So most of the properties, well, at least half of the properties sitting on the rental market are likely to be too expensive for you or to put you into housing stress. By way of contrast, if we go backwards down to 1981, that figure was 19%. So that gives you some sense of the trend that we've been following over the last two generations. So in 1981, you would have had an average rental of 19% of the average wage. Now we're looking at close to 30%. If we go on to the next slide. Another way of cutting the issue is to have a look at Commonwealth Rent Assistance, so CRA. I'll talk about how rent assistance works a little bit later on, but the problems faced by low to medium income households in securing affordable rental accommodation are compounded by the fact that CRA is pretty low. It's indexed to the CPI, it's not indexed to the rental market. So the number of CRA recipients in housing stress remains stagnant since 2009. 40.7% of CRA recipients were in housing stress in 2009, 40.3% in 2012. So pretty similar, somewhere around 40%, hasn't changed. The proportion of people receiving the maximum level of CRA is steadily increasing, and that's significant because how much CRA you receive depends on how much rent you pay. So if you pay over a certain level, your entitlement to CRA is triggered, and then you're paid 75 cents for every dollar over a certain level up to a maximum amount. And we're seeing increasing numbers of people getting up to that maximum amount and hitting that ceiling. Anecdotally, what we're hearing is that the rents go on rising above that, but you can't get any more CRA. The Welfare Rights Network did a very interesting report back in 2013 where they concluded that rent assistance has failed to keep up with private rental costs, which have increased over 32% over the last 5 years. But significantly, that same report found that 62% of all single CRA recipients were women. And I find that very interesting because this is where we start to see that gender issue coming out in this issue. The Henry Tax Review had a look at the CRA and made some recommendations about what to do about it. And the main recommendation was that the rent assistance might be adequate if it was indexed to reflect growth in the market rather than CPI. And that's one of the recommendations that we'll be discussing later on. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see a different way of looking at Commonwealth rent assistance. This is the percentages who are in housing stress, and you can see that those figures haven't changed dramatically. So what we've seen is even though the number of people receiving the maximum amount has increased significantly, we've still got the same number of people in housing stress, which means that giving more people the maximum amount hasn't fixed the problem. On to the next slide. A different indicator again, if we look at home ownership rather than rental, this is first home buyers as a proportion of all purchases, and that's quite a plummet. And it's an interesting plummet because it's one that's finally bringing a number of organisations, non-traditional organisations, to the housing affordability debate. We're, for example, having some very useful and fruitful discussions with the Real Estate Institute of Australia because this has a significant impact for their members. Essentially, young people are not buying their first homes. The property market at the moment is being driven by investors. The National Housing Supply Council, RIP, we don't have it anymore, observed in 2012 that home ownership is declining significantly across most age groups in the population, which is interesting. The proportion of low-income households in mortgage stress remains unrelentingly high. 42% of mortgage-holding households in the bottom half of income distribution, so that's those people at medium income and below, have costs of more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. So we're looking at 42% of people at medium income or below are in housing stress in relation to their mortgage. On top of this, government assistance to first home buyers isn't managing to overcome competition with investor buyers. So first homeowner buyers are continuing to make up a persistently low proportion of the owner-occupier market. They're currently at 14.6%. with few indications that this will change, and that's a really small slice of the market, particularly given where it was traditionally. You can see up there it was well over a third at one point. So between 2006 and 2011, mortgage costs increased at a greater rate than our wages. Sydney had the worst, as you might expect, but interestingly, local government areas outside the capital cities are experiencing the fastest growing mortgage costs, which is a matter of great concern. If we move on to the next slide. Apologies for all the doom and gloom, by the way. We will move on to what we can proactively do about this shortly. But one of the most telling things and one of the most important pieces of information that we used to get from the National Housing Supply Council is the dwelling gap. This is a figure that tells us what the level of undersupply in the market is. By 2011, which was the last reliable figure we got out of them, we had a gap of somewhere between 2,280 and some of the figures actually put it as high as 238,000. So we've used the conservative figure there. But that chronic undersupply of housing is adding enormous pressure to the housing market. So in 2012 National Housing State of Supply report, it tracked that annual growth in the dwelling gap and stated categorically that without action to increase affordable housing supply, that gap is going to reach 369,000 by 2016. And that's going to pose a major budgetary and policy challenge for all levels of government. So this is a problem that is growing, and one that we're a little bit concerned is simply not sufficiently on the agenda at the moment. So when we take that information about the dwelling gap back and think about what we've seen about the median income and the rental market, you begin to see that if that dwelling gap is skewed towards the lower end of the market, you're really going to have a very difficult time finding anything that you can move into. If you're in medium income, so as we were saying before, nurses, firemen, anybody in essential services, which is alarming, and educators, you're going to have a very difficult time getting into the private rental market, let alone being able to afford a mortgage. On to the next slide. So the next question, having sort of established that we have a problem, but at this point a non-gendered problem, why is the ERA interested in this? Because we are very much a women's organisation. We're interested in issues of women's equality. Where's the equality issue here? And at first glance, it's interesting. You can make a very good argument based purely on unexamined data at a high level that this is actually slightly a men's issue. So if you look at the data that came out of the 2011 census on homelessness specifically, you can see that it's an issue that affects slightly more men than women. The figures are somewhere around 46% women. So, you know, not a huge gap, 46 to 54, but, you know, dominated slightly by men. That lines up with what you might think of as the popular image of homelessness. If you think about somebody who is homeless, the go-to figure is a man who is sleeping rough. When you ask, an interesting experiment we carried out today was to ask Google to search for images of homeless persons, and what you get is images of men. There are a couple of reasons for that, partly because visible homelessness tends to be more male than female. Women tend to avoid sleeping rough for security reasons if they can. Men are more likely to choose sleeping rough as an option. When women become homeless, they're much more likely to try and make themselves invisible. They'll couch surf, they'll stay with relatives. If they're sleeping rough, they'll hide. And so some of the figures on homelessness, despite the fact the ABS has done that very good work in expanding the definition to include secondary homelessness, even those women who are rough sleeping are probably not being counted on census night or in subsequent counts because they're making themselves invisible deliberately in order to be physically secure. So we think there's an invisible population there. If we move on to the next slide, you can see here a couple more cuts of the basic data about housing. So what about people who are in housing stress from that 2011 census, who are paying rent over 30%? Comes back down to being much closer to half-half, but again, it's still not an issue that you could call gendered at that point. And the next slide, please. And you'll see the same thing here with people who are paying more than 30% on their mortgages. Actually, there's a very slight swing towards women on the figures here, but it's still very close to 50% either way. So on that census data, that very high-level data, we're looking at an issue that's not gendered, that appears to affect men and women more or less equally. On to the next slide. So you can see here similar figures. We've got that rise over time from 03 up to 12. So men come up from 31% of people in rental stress up to 38%. Women come up from 29% to 37%. So again, on that high level data, we're seeing what looks like a problem that affects men more than women. On to the next slide. But when you start digging down into it, it starts to look a little bit different. This graph, unfortunately some of the labels there might be a bit small, so I'll read them out from the left-hand side. The first column is who's rough sleeping or in improvised housing. And you can see that there are slightly more men in red than there are women in yellow. The next one along, however, is who's in public or community housing. And you can see that we've got a significant difference between women and men, women in the yellow. And that tells us that women are making different choices and are availing themselves of different options in relation to housing that put them in some cases marginal, in some cases inappropriate housing, but are nevertheless choosing options that get themselves housed at any cost in order to avoid homelessness. The final figure there is who's living in public and community housing and is over 60. And you can see quite a difference there as well with women in the yellow. So moving on to the next slide, in answer to the question, is housing a gendered issue, we've got some concerns about the definitions of housing stress. We think that there are, based on the anecdotal evidence that we're hearing from our member organisations who are saying that our members know people, know women who are in housing stress. And interestingly, we've seen a progression in that reporting. We've seen our members go from telling us that they know of women who are in housing stress to their own family members, women in their own families are in housing stress, through to I'm in housing stress, and that's the one that we're starting to hear from our member organisations now. So it's come closer and closer to home as we've been going. So we're starting to wonder whether women are actually underrepresented in the stats. The next point is the public face of homelessness, as we've discussed, is male. And an interesting exercise is to sit down and think how many words for a homeless person can you come up with that are gendered male and how many can you come up with that are gendered female. And we tried that today and we really only came up with homeless woman and bag lady, which, one of which is fairly neutral and the other one of which has some fairly strong pejorative terms to it. There are lots of terms for a homeless man. And so, we've got this image about homelessness, so we may need to challenge some assumptions there. And if we're right about the definitions, then we've got a level of hidden housing stress that we need to deal with. And there's some information we'll go into in a moment about future trends, which means that this is all going to become very clear on the face of it very shortly anyway. One other factor in relation to housing and gender is that women seem to be more likely to seek out services and are more likely to ask for help. And as a result, they're more likely to get themselves into marginal or inappropriate housing, which nevertheless takes them out of the category of housing stress and homelessness. So that as far as the stats are concerned, they're housed in a non-stressful situation. But they may have traded off some fairly important things in order to put themselves there and avoid homelessness. If we move on to the next slide, I'm just having a little bit of a look at the time. I'm running a little bit behind, so I'll move along. In order to test this idea about housing definitions and housing stress definitions, ERA ran a survey last year in which we asked people over a website to identify whether they were in housing stress by telling us what their fortnightly income was and how much they were spending on a fortnightly basis on their housing costs. Once we'd identified who was in housing stress and who wasn't, we then went on to ask a series of questions about the choices that those individuals had made about their housing. We asked them things like, are you living somewhere where you feel safe? Are you living somewhere that's in poor repair? Are you living somewhere that costs a lot to heat and cool? Are you living near enough to work, or do you have to pay a lot for travel? Are you living in overcrowded circumstances? Are you living in a share house but would prefer not to? And so we were looking for those trade-offs that women might be making in relation to their housing in order to take themselves out of that housing stress category. And the responses were really interesting. Alarmingly, we found that 41% of the women who responded were in housing stress and had what we called poor housing well-being, which means that they identified at least 2 of those housing well-being factors as being a problem for them. We found that a further 20% were in housing stress, but their housing was okay, it met their needs. A further 19% weren't in housing stress and had good housing well-being, so those people were fine. But then there's the pink 20% who were not in housing stress but had poor housing well-being. So that's 20% of our more than 600 respondents would not have appeared in the housing stress stats, but were in unsatisfactory housing. What ERA thinks is going on is that women are making decisions which defer housing stress across other areas of their lives. We think that women are incurring costs in relation to additional childcare, additional travel costs, not having family supports around them or other supports, not being close to their medical supports, all sorts of decisions that make their lives more expensive, make their lives more difficult in other ways in order to make sure that their housing is sustainable. We think that women are prioritising sustainable housing above other areas of their lives and that that's resulting in their housing stress being hidden because they've made those decisions because of housing stress. If they could find somewhere affordable to live, where they could be safe, where they could live close to their work and incur fewer costs for transport and childcare, then they would be doing so. So we think that that's a major problem with the 30% definition of housing stress. We would like to see a definition that relates to housing well-being. If we move on to the next slide. Oh, we've lost part of our graph there. So what we've got there is a graph which tells us we know that we've got, or we think we've got, an invisible population of women who are experiencing housing stress. Here what we're seeing is what's coming. And this is the figure that's actually spooking politicians when we talk to them about it at the federal level. And one of the really useful techniques that we've used recently is to go into meetings with federal parliamentarians with the figures from their electorate of how many women in their electorate are on a median income or less, are single, do not own their own home, and are over 45 years old. And when you look at those figures, we've got men at 38% and women at 62%. In real terms, that's 600,828 women who over the next 15 to 20 years are going to retire. They're currently working. They're on anything up to the median income. They are currently renting or in some other form of non-tenured housing, and they are going to get into trouble. This is the group that we are starting to see coming out of our membership. People who are saying, I've worked my whole life, particularly housing, community sector workers are coming to us and saying, I don't know what I'm going to do when I retire. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to retire. And that group is probably single-handedly going to skew all those housing figures that we saw at the beginning that are currently skewed slightly towards men. We're going to see housing stress becoming a gendered issue over the next 15 years in a very big way, regardless of whether or not we sort out this issue about the hidden women. Moving on to the next slide. Other factors to take into account when you're thinking about housing as a gendered issue is that women are generally overrepresented in key poverty indicators. That bottom 10% of women that we were talking about who have, or bottom 10% of income earners who have particular difficulty finding accommodation are predominantly female. More than 50%. And so that's a result of a long, complicated series of inequalities, structural inequalities over the economic lifespan of a woman. Everything that ranges from superannuation through to the cost of childcare, casualisation of work, breaks from work to care, all that sort of stuff works together to ensure that women tend to be overrepresented in those poverty indicators. So housing as an issue for women is an integral part of that whole question about whether or not women can be economically self-sustainable within the present system. And that economic inequity is then compounded by a number of other factors where women face specific disadvantage because of their gender. So the higher prevalence of violence and other forms of abuse for women, the fact that women are more likely to experience disability than men. So we've got a number of issues which combine together to make women particularly vulnerable when you're trying to compete in a very tight property market. The other problem that concerns ERA is that a large percentage of the housing stock that's available, both in the private and the public markets, doesn't reflect the needs of women, particularly of an ageing population of women. We don't have principles of universal design being applied across the board in relation to new properties in affordable housing, that sort of thing. So for an ageing population who are increasingly going to need accessibility in their properties, we aren't able to supply that. So we're going to see a greater percentage of women who are living in properties that are unsafe for them, that are situated in the wrong location for them. They're not close enough to shops, they're not close enough to services or to medical facilities. Women who are situated in properties that effectively give them a low level of housing well-being. So moving on again. So what are our key messages? What are the sort of things that we need to be telling politicians about housing? The first one is to make them clear about the fact that underestimating levels of housing stress for women. The thing to ask for in relation to that is that we need research into that. We need to know more about that. We need to know about those decisions that women are making. We need to point out the number of people in housing stress is going to rise as the baby boomer women retire. And of course, because women on average live longer than men, they're going to need to make their own scarce financial resources last longer. And there is going to be a skew towards women in the general population because the number of baby boomer men will gradually reach the end of their lives. The federal government needs to reform the tax system. And this is where we see ERA's main focus of work, to reduce those economic inequalities and to promote investment in affordable housing. We also need to invest in affordable housing stock. State and local governments, on the other hand, need coherent affordable housing policies. And importantly, those policies must contain a gender lens, which means that whenever they make a point about what needs to be done, the government needs to ask itself the question, is this a decision or a policy that will impact on women differently to men? And is this an opportunity to address an inequality experienced by women? So the experience of women in housing needs to be taken into account consciously and deliberately at every stage of the policy process. And that's an important thing that we can all ask for when we're talking to politicians, is that all of the policy development needs to have gender disaggregated data. So when you report on how many people are homeless, you report on how many men are homeless and how many women are homeless, because the experiences are not the same. Next slide, please. Other things that we're asking for are that the Commonwealth Government retain the National Affordable Housing Agreement, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, and reinstate the National Rental Affordability Scheme, which is unfortunately defunded at the last budget. ERA will also be asking for the government to implement a surcharge of 10% on superannuation contributions. The reason for that is that that gets us revenue of $750 million, which can then go straight into an affordable housing growth fund. So that money can then go into purchasing, actually purchasing properties. And then we would say that, the purchase of those properties and the policies around that need to have a gender lens on them. We need to make sure that we've got a significant number of those properties are suitable for the needs of various different groups of women. We're also calling on the government to implement recommendation of 14 of the Henry Tax Review, which is reducing capital gains tax exemption by 10%. That gets you $1 billion in revenue, just taking it down by 10%. And that $1 billion can then go into NAHA, into our top recommendation on that slide, and into NRAS. Next slide. And the other Commonwealth level request is that we appropriately index the Commonwealth rent assistance in line with market rents, as we were discussing earlier. Next slide. The sort of things that you can ask for at state and local government level are slightly different because they're not quite so tax-oriented. But you can ask for things like, has your government got an affordable housing policy? And when you develop that housing policy, where were women? Is your data gender disaggregated? What sort of benchmarks are you requiring your agencies to report against? Do you require them to gender disaggregate their data? Do you have different benchmarks for men and women? What sort of policies are there about the different properties that you're buying? What sort of work are you doing in relation to innovative property models? Things like land trusts, where a charity continues to hold the land while you buy the bricks and mortar. So you've got an asset that can be passed on to your children or can be realised in order to help fund move into a nursing home or something similar. And yet you don't have to go the whole hog on paying market rent for the entire bundle of land and property. Equity sharing is a similar process where you may not own 100% of the property, but you might own a significant proportion of it. And they're models that are available to state governments to have a look into. And then we need to look at whether the housing stock meets the needs of women. So we need policies that increase investment in affordable and low-cost housing, but we need those policies to prioritise the suitability, the appropriateness and the accessibility of design and location. And there needs to be consultation around that. You need to work out what's right for your location. So what's needed in terms of housing stock in the Northern Territory is going to be very different to what's needed in housing stock in Victoria. And so that consultation is crucial. Next slide. So moving on to who does what. And this is good thing to know about because this tells you who to speak to about which of those asks. So when you're talking to your local Commonwealth Member of Parliament or your local Senator for the Commonwealth Senate, you could be talking to them about the Commonwealth Rent Assistance. You can be talking to them about anything to do with those Commonwealth taxes or market reform, so the National Rental Affordability Scheme type models, so stimulus type programs. And you can be talking to them about properly funding partnerships with states and territories in order to get, things working at state and territory level as well. Then when you're talking to state and territory level MPs, MLAs, senators, what have you in your particular area, you can be talking to them about their planning and zoning laws. When they're looking at, for example, urban infill, when they're looking at their density zoning, are they considering the needs of women? Are they making sure that they have a significant number of properties that, for example, will be held up to universal design principles so that an ageing population will be able to use them? Are there good transport corridors that will be accessible? Are they close to community? Are there local shops? Are there local services? That sort of thing. You can also talk to them about land release and about acquiring and managing public housing, because that's who runs public housing, although a significant amount of the funding comes from the Commonwealth Government. And you can talk to them about planning and building standards, and that's where that stuff about universal design and about safety and that sort of thing come in. And you can talk to them about stamp duty. There's a big push on at the moment, particularly from some of the property type interests, to argue that the solution to the housing affordability crisis is to remove stamp duty. We're not convinced by that. Our big concern about that is that stamp duty represents a significant amount of the revenue for most states and territories. I think it's something like 60%. I'm making that figure up, but it is something very high. And so it isn't easy to see how you would go about replacing that revenue, and that revenue is needed in order to get these other things like planning and zoning going and to get the public housing properly maintained and stocks built up. So our view is that although there are people out there advocating for stamp duty to be reduced or removed, that if you do that, you've really got to be able to answer the question, well, where is state and territory revenue going to come from? On to the next slide. Now, I want to have a quick talk about the Commonwealth housing structure because it underpins a lot of the funding that the state and territories get. I had here a rather nifty presentation, but I don't know whether or not we're going to be able to see it. have you had any success in opening it up on a website, Christine? You would need to close the PowerPoint completely.
Yep, hold on.
And then I've sent you a link in an email which you would need to open in a web browser.
Yep, just doing that now. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Full screen view. There you go.
Fantastic. And the arrows down the bottom are how we scroll through this. Okay, so what I've got here is a diagram of national housing policy at the federal level. To give you a brief history, back in 2009, Kevin Rudd, one of the big ideas that came out of Kevin Rudd's Ideas Symposium was that affordable housing was, sort of the issue that needed dealing with. And so he commissioned a discussion paper called A Place to Call Home. That paper led to a lot of very useful discussion and eventually resulted in something called the National Affordable Housing Agreement. And the National Affordable Housing Agreement was a really ambitious document. It was hoping to completely eliminate rough sleeping and most of homelessness by 2016. We're not going to get there. However, it's been a really interesting process getting there because we've learned a lot of things about how we need to collect data about housing and how we need to think about housing. So the National Affordable Housing Agreement, if we can go on to the next slide. It's an agreement of the Council of Australian Governments. So it's an agreement between the Commonwealth and each of the states and territories. It's basically provided for a number of high-level benchmarks, which were frankly very underdeveloped and didn't contain anything near enough information about how we'd report back on those. And it was supported by the 3 partnership agreements. So if we go on to the next slide. So the first of the agreements was the National Partnership Agreement on Social Housing. Move on to the next slide. This agreement has now expired. It was one of the state and each of the state and territories under this plan produced their own implementation plans. So they produced a structure and a set of criteria that were relevant to their own jurisdiction, and they agreed to be held to that and to report against it to COAG. Next slide. The aim of the NPAS was to increase the stock of social housing. So they set up the Social Housing Growth Fund, which was a significant investment. So $1 billion plus, I think, went into that. And that fund did succeed in meeting some of its targets in terms of the number of properties built. Unfortunately, it didn't actually have an effect on the dwelling gap because the dwelling gap continued to increase. The best you could say was that it probably held some of the worst at bay, but it didn't actually address the growing problem that we had. Next slide. So NPAR, the social housing agreement, sorry, NPAS, the social housing agreement, has now ended. Next slide. The National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness is still running. It's the place where the old arrangement under the old SAP, social and assisted, or I can't remember the acronym now, but it was the money that went for supported community and social housing from the Commonwealth to the States. That money went into this agreement. And so it's vital that the government keeps this agreement going, because if they lose this agreement, then we end up with a situation where the states and territories aren't getting that Commonwealth money through any particular mechanism anymore, and they need it. NPAR set up 3 key strategies to reduce homelessness. Firstly, there was prevention and early intervention. There was breaking the cycle, and improving and expanding service response, particularly they're interested in wraparound services. And again, state and territory implementation plans so that it was regionally appropriate. It technically expired in 2013, but it's been rolled over year by year. There are currently negotiations underway, and a couple of states and territories are holding out. So if you're in talks with a state and territory MP, find out whether your state or territory has agreed to the national agreement on homelessness, because it's quite important that everyone comes on board with that. On to the next slide. As part of NPAR, we had the Place to Call Home program, which built 600 dwellings, which met its targets, so that was good. But again, growth in housing stress and homelessness outstripped those targets. Go on to the next slide. Then we had the National Partnership Agreement on Remote Indigenous Housing. Next slide. This agreement goes on to 2018, so it was given a long scope. It was developed at least partly in response to the fact that overcrowding is a really severe problem in Indigenous communities, particularly in the Northern Territory, where a significant proportion, something around the level of 80% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander headed households are in overcrowded conditions. That agreement has been sort of operating on its own, rather independently from the rest of the NAHA process, and hopefully we can just keep it running and keep it moving along to keep that money flowing down to states and territories. Back out. And on to the next one. So NRAS, the National Rental Assistance Scheme. This was a really good innovative approach. Next slide. It was a scheme which intended to increase the supply of properties by giving tax incentives to people who are prepared to stump up to build particular properties that met particular criteria. That program is being defunded. As from the last budget. And in any conversation that you have with politicians about this area, it would be a really good idea to raise that and say that what we need is some sort of scheme to encourage investment by private investors in the affordable housing end of the market. Commonwealth rent assistance costs an enormous amount in terms of the budget, $4.3 billion, but isn't yet getting us to the point where it's actually making a difference for people. As I was saying earlier on, the rate of payment you get depends on already being eligible for a Centrelink payment, and you get 75% for every dollar over a threshold up to a maximum payment. And as we've seen, there are big issues with how that's pegged, whether it's pegged to the CPI or whether it's pegged to the rate of rise in the rental market. On to the next slide. So that is essentially how affordable housing works at the federal level. So I'll take questions on that later on at the end. But there's then another layer at state and territory level and another one at local government level. So knowing that this is the background is useful, I think. I'll move on now just quickly to parliamentary advocacy and some tips about what to do if you do want to hold a meeting with a local representative in relation to this. I think I've had somebody come off mute because I'm getting an echo. Let's see how that's going. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. If we can come out of the Prezi and back into, I'm making poor Christine's life very difficult here. But if we move on to the next slide in the PowerPoint. When you're trying to get an appointment to see a local member of parliament, there are a number of things you can do to make things easier. The first stuff to know about is, where do you want to meet them? There are a number of pros and cons around this. Do you want to go and meet them at their electorate office, or do you want to meet them when they're at parliament, when parliament is actually sitting? In an electorate office, you generally get a little bit more time with a parliamentarian. They're more relaxed and they're a little more secure. And so sometimes you can get a more responsive meeting in an electorate office. On the other hand, if you go to Parliament during a sitting week, you will hit a lot more targets in a much shorter time. You can organise sort of 3 or 4 or even 5 appointments on a sitting day and get to speak either to the parliamentarian themselves or possibly to an advisor. So it's a good idea to use those advisors. If you can't, it's nice to get to the parliamentarian, and in some cases it's very important. But it's useful to have had a meeting or to take advantage of a meeting with an advisor to word them up, because it's the advisor who's going to be talking, reflecting back to the parliamentarian what it is that you've been saying. So you want that backup, particularly if you subsequently then get to speak to the parliamentarian. To diary manager, basically. So in the office of each parliamentarian, they'll have a diary manager. When you phone up, you could just get anybody on the phone. It's a good idea to ask for the diary manager to make your appointments, because then you're not waiting forever for somebody to get back to you. And be very specific when you ask for the meeting about what it's about and who is coming. Don't deviate from that if you can avoid it, and if you do, let them know in advance. And if you end up bringing somebody else to the meeting, let them know the name of that person and why they're coming. They don't like being surprised, and so you'll get much better results if the parliamentarian knows well what it is that you're coming to talk to them about. Before you have your meeting, think about identifying, first of all, what the problem is that you want to talk about, in this case, affordable housing for women. Articulate that. See if you can get it down to a couple of sentences about what it is that bothers you about affordable housing. But then know what it is that you think the answer is, or what action you think the parliamentarian should take in relation to that. That's known colloquially as your ask. You go into your meeting with your ask. And your aim in the meeting is to get that ask recognised, firstly, and secondly, accepted, to get them to propose some action or to agree to some action. Make sure you've got your data. Write down your major points for your own reference. It's really useful to have some talking points in front of you. Include the most important numbers and data, but don't have too much in front of you because you'll get yourself all tangled up. You can always supply stuff afterwards. You can say, look, I'll find out about that and get that to your advisor. But you want to make sure that the figures you do quote are accurate. And make sure that you've got a summary of the issue, like a fact sheet, that you can leave with the parliamentarian. If you refer to any important research, submissions and that sort of thing, you could bring copies of those and leave those as well. Or if you don't have them, make sure you've got a summary, or that you can at least tell them about it in some detail. On to the next slide. During the meeting itself, don't be late. That's a big one, because particularly if you're meeting at in a parliament, your time is likely to be curtailed. You need to be prepared to be fairly flexible. Don't book meetings too close to each other, because it may well be that the bells go and your parliamentarian has to run, and you are asked to wait. So you need to give yourself the ability to be able to do that. Confirm how much time the parliamentarian has and stick to it. Less is always more in these meetings. And avoid overly emotive language where you can. Keep the tone of the meeting very professional. One thing that I've noticed is it's a good idea to avoid acronyms, unless the parliamentarian indicates that they're familiar with them. But most importantly, listen as well as talk. Think about what responses you're getting from the individual and tailor your message to that. Try and find a rapport, a connection between what you want to say and where they're coming from. That's a lot easier to say than to do, but it's something that comes more easily with practice. Knowing a little bit about who the parliamentarian is in advance can be very useful in relation to that. And finally, try to get the parliamentarian to commit to a particular action and know what that action is in advance, as we were saying earlier. The other thing you can do, which is useful, is ask the parliamentarian who else you should be speaking to. Who's got the power to make decisions on this issue? Who allocates or controls the budget for it? Who writes the policy? Who's important in the bureaucracy in relation to this, who also needs to know about it? And if you're talking to someone sympathetic to the issue, ask them for strategy feedback. Is this going to fly with the government, or is it going to sound terrible to them? What can we do to make it sound better? That sort of thing. After the meeting, make sure you follow up. Send a thank you email. Send any information that you said that you would send to them. Keep them informed about progress. Keep this issue alive for them. And then, if you can, build the relationship. So are there other areas that you could work together with? What's Soroptimist doing that they might be interested in opening, or that they might be interested in contributing to? So if you've got that relationship going, they remember you and they remember your issues. On to the next slide, which I think might be our last. So I've put together an advocacy package, most of which I've sent through to Anne. There are 1 or 2 documents still to go through to her tomorrow. So I'll ask her to send those out to people who have RSVP'd to this meeting. It contains our fact sheets, so you can leave those with parliamentarians. I'm going to draft for you a suggested letter that you might want to use. Try to avoid using it as a form letter. They tend to get ignored. Try to put it in your own words but cover the same areas that are in the suggestion. I'll also give you our pre-budget submission and 2 other submissions actually that we've made in relation to housing, one in relation to housing generally to a Senate committee, and one to a Senate committee on violence against women in the context of housing. They might be useful in terms of finding data. There are lots of very good footnotes to be able to follow there. And I'll send you out also a slightly longer version of this advocacy information that will give you something to work with, that in particular includes a little section on how to get people to yes, how to persuade people to change their minds. Hopefully that will be useful for you. And if we move on to the final slide, I've put some links there, and one of the things I'll send out in the package is a copy of the slides from this presentation. Those links, the top one is to our website, which has a housing section, but the other ones have interesting information about different aspects of the housing issue. One thing that you'll notice about them is that they are not gendered. Our work is one of the only national level organisations who are doing this in a gendered way, and so our call for gendered data is one that we're starting to get raised eyebrows about, because it's not something that there's been a lot of thought about in relation to that. But that information is useful in terms of the general problems and some of the solutions that are being proposed. And that's it from me. So thank you very much for your attention. Have we got any questions?
Oh, thank you, Helen. That was very informative. I just want to answer one question from Nicole. Nicole also reiterates how useful this presentation has been to her, and she wanted to know if it could be shared by email. I'd just like to let all the attendees know that this presentation has been recorded, and there will be a link available from the SASWP website in the coming days, and it will be made available to Helen also to provide the link down to anyone who would wish to view the whole presentation. We have a couple of questions. Joan Garham she has a couple of questions, but they all relate to shared occupancy, so I'll combine a couple of together for you, Helen. She says, does housing options also include shared occupancy when you were given those stats? And do you know the percentage of people in shared housing?
Off the top of my head, no, I don't. The figures on secondary homelessness, which in some cases shared housing can qualify as secondary homelessness where there's severe overcrowding and lack of security of tenure, tend to be difficult to break down because they come out of that very high-level census data. What we do know is that shared housing makes up a larger proportion of the market than it used to do. and that a larger proportion of young women are living in mixed-gendered shared housing. Anecdotally, we're hearing that that's an issue for young women in terms of a sense of security and safety. It's not necessarily the case that somebody living in a mixed-gendered household is feeling insecure, but we are finding that women are feeling like they're not having the capacity to make decisions. One of the problems with shared housing as an area for collecting data is that it encompasses a range of different life situations. So shared housing can be everything from unrelated people living together, often groups of young professionals or students, all the way through to multi-generational families moving together because they're unable, not because it's their choice, but because they're unable to exercise any other option. And so finding the data for that is actually quite difficult. I may be able to dig something out for you though, so if you give your details to us, I'll see what I can find. Christine, are you still there?
I beg your pardon, it would help if I unmute myself. Joan also wanted to talk about boarding houses, and that we don't hear a lot about boarding houses taking up the excess of people wanting to have affordable housing. And do you know of many regulations against boarding houses at the local government level?
They do exist, and boarding houses tend to be fairly strictly regulated where they're permitted. They're usually included in secondary homelessness categories because your security of tenure and your level of privacy and frankly your level of power over your environment are pretty limited in a boarding house environment. And so people who are living in boarding house are included in those stats on, sometimes including the stats on homelessness as people who are in secondary homelessness. Women tend to be represented at a lower level in boarding house stats than men. There aren't very many boarding houses that are aimed specifically at women. Most of them are either mixed genders or male. And the anecdotal information that I have is that a lot of individual women will avoid boarding houses like the plague and will rather couch surf because they view them as being inherently dangerous to a degree because you don't have a lot of control over your own space. So we do tend to see, I think this is one of those areas where we see that gender split playing out where men may choose rough sleeping or boarding houses. Women are more likely to go to community housing services or public housing and seek assistance through official channels like that. So from ERA's perspective, we spend less time focusing on boarding houses because it is less of an area for women. Doesn't mean it's not an area for women, and for many women it's the only option available to them, so it is still an important area.
Joan, I have unmuted you. Would you like to ask any other questions, or were they satisfactorily answered? All right. We might come back to Joan. I actually had a question, Helen. You did answer some of it as you moved on with your presentation, but it was in one of your earlier slides where you were talking about affordable housing in the private sector. And I was sort of thinking to myself while you're talking about that, is it that because the private sector, the people who are going into investment type homes, so to speak, are looking for that as a return on their investment as they retire. So therefore they're not going into that lower demographic area that would make it affordable for people. But I did notice as you moved on with your presentation, you did also talk about looking at the tax reform system to try to make that more accessible.
Yeah, it's an interesting area because there is a very great reluctance among private investors to enter into the low-income market. Part of that is due to a perception that low-income tenants are a greater risk than higher-income tenants. That if you can afford to do so, you buy into the higher end of the market. Your tenants are more likely to remain employed, to have less of an income flow problem, to have fewer problems affording the rent. And so you're more likely to get your rent coming in regularly. There are also prejudices about people on low incomes and antisocial behaviour, and you hear a lot of investors talking about the risk to their investment from damage to the properties and that sort of thing. The beauty of the NRAS system was that we had an advantage that you could offer to investors that you don't get from the high end of the private market, which was that if you invested in those specifically selected properties that were to be let out at a reduced amount of the market rate, you got tax breaks. So that brought it into the realm of the sort of tax breaks that you get generally in terms of things like negative gearing, but gave it, firstly, the backing of the government, which gives you a nice bit of security, and secondly, gave you a little bit of an extra edge in terms of the tax advantage. And so it was starting to build a market for that affordable investment. And that would have been a really good proactive way of addressing that housing shortage, that 228,000 we were talking about. Unfortunately, we've lost it from the budget. There's no indication that it's going to be refunded in the future. So that's one of the areas that ERA is going to be advocating for, that we need either NRAS back or something similar in its place.
It still seems to me then that even though we could get the tax reforms and the government could, throw some money out there, that we still have to overcome people's perception to providing housing for these lower income people.
I think that's right, and I think that having a scheme like NRAS where you're more or less guaranteed your return is useful in that respect, because it goes some way to answering those prejudices, although it may not remove them. There are other models like the defence housing model, where your rent income is guaranteed and the government pays for the renovations needed or the upkeep. That's a more expensive model, but it works very successfully for the Defence Department and gets a very high level of private investment. So there are other models available other than NRAS. And the aim of them is to make the benefits of the scheme outweigh those prejudices.
Right. Thank you. I've had no other questions. So if anybody would like to ask any more questions, please, pop it in the question there for a couple of seconds. If not, I would also like to pass on some other thanks. There's been some comments come through, Helen, about how worthwhile this has been and how clear and the understanding has been really worthwhile too. I'll now pass back to Anne, who will close off for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. First of all, I'd really like to thank Christine for all the help and all the technical assistance she's given me, who's a little bit of a technophobe, and especially thanks to Helen Daly-Fisher. I think it's been a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I think if we can persuade people to have a look at the website, to pick it up, the people who haven't been able to attend, I think that we'll just get it out there. So, it's a good example of Soroptimist inspiring action and creating opportunity by advocacy, by creating safe and healthy environments, increasing access to education, developing leadership and practical skills. So I think if you can, talk about this in your clubs, develop advocacy projects, and I think it's a terrific start for us. So again, thank you very, very much, Helen from ERA, and to Christine for all your help. And I know the little glitches that have that have happened, and Christine just handles them. So thank you both very much, and thank you all for attending tonight. Thanks a lot.